Students of criminal justice learn very early about Hebert Pecker's two models of criminal justice developed in the 1960s, the crime control model and the due process model. A crime control model focuses on efficiency and crime suppression, seeing crime control as more important than individual freedom. On the other hand, a due process model focuses on having a just and fair criminal justice system for all and upholding constitutional rights. Every criminal justice system worth its salt will have to find its balance between the two models. While it seems to me that many Singaporeans would prioritize crime control, fair-minded Singaporeans would also want a system where law enforcement agencies must produce evidence of a high standard before anyone is convicted and punished. To that end, I would urge the government to look into finding the resources to enable law enforcement to perform their roles more effectively. For today, I will take just two aspects: recording of statements and supporting crime victims. During the debate on the justice motion last November, my party colleagues and I pointed to certain aspects of the justice system where more could be done to ensure its fairness, accessibility, and independence. In the main, the government did not disagree with us, stating that we were, and I quote, pushing an open door, unquote. To that end, it seems to me that some review of priorities should be considered. For instance, on the way statements are recorded from suspects, we know that video recording is a good safeguard to ensure that statements are not coerced. It also protects officers from false accusations. We heard from the minister then that video recording was the gold standard, but resources were a constraint. When I suggested recording statements in other languages for suspects not fluent in English, I was told that it was not possible. But these are being done in other countries. So is it a case of priorities? As for our response towards crime victims, my assessment is that we lag behind other countries in our measures. To be fair, there have been some steps in this direction to recognize crime victims as stakeholders. For instance, the police service pledge requires officers to give victims an interim update within 7 days of reporting a case. Where offenders are charged in court, victims may be heard in certain cases through the use of victim impact statements, and there are higher chances of them receiving compensation from offenders at the time of sentencing. However, I believe these measures are not used in the vast majority of court cases. Madam, we can do a more thorough review of how to involve the victim at critical stages of the case, such as during pre-trial hearings on bail, and explaining to them the reasons for prosecutorial decisions, such as what charges are being preferred, or when there is a decision not to prosecute. I had spoken about this last November and will not repeat further here. More recently, the murder that took place at River Valley High School makes me wonder if every frontline officer has been adequately trained in the people-to-people skills necessary to handle traumatized victims, and in particular, minors. Suffice to say, victims are stakeholders and their cooperation can make or break a case. To this end, we must not neglect the training of law enforcement officers in critical soft skills that will make them more effective. Madam, let me summarize. I've highlighted today that even as the police has indeed been at the forefront of keeping Singapore safe, other agencies have as well. In addition, and more importantly, we must never think that safety is the only metric by which to judge the quality of law enforcement agencies. The need to do justice and to act fairly is equally critical. Having more inclusive case processes would also be in order.
Ms. Lim made reference to Professor Hebert Pecker's work on due process and crime control. While it's not so clear, I think Ms. Lim would probably move a little bit more on the due process model, or move more on fall on the side of the due process model. The approach we have taken is not ideological. It is to see what is suitable, what works in Singapore. And as I said, in 1976, the steps we took would probably be described as more akin to the crime control model. And as Ms. Lim was speaking, I remembered a speech by our former Chief Justice, Mr. Chan Sek Keong. So I apologize, I have to read it on my phone because I hadn't known that the point was going to be made. This was a lecture that the 2008 I think Justice Chan was Chief Justice at that point. He made, in the centenary of Mr. David Marshall's birth, and this is what he had to say, and I can do no better than what perhaps the greatest jurist Singapore has seen said about this process. He says, from paragraph 13 onwards, before I discuss some of these amendments, let me now sketch out for you the features of the criminal justice process that was in place in Singapore before 1976. We then had an investigative and trial process regulated by the Criminal Procedure Code and the Evidence Act, which basically provided the framework for a common law trial process, which was highly admired, if not revered, in England at that time. I make a point to take members through this in some detail because if you want a safe and secure Singapore with due process for all of us, it's important to get this fundamental principle right, because there is and there will always be a tendency to move towards a much more of putting hurdles and processes in the way of the police. The point is to strike the right balance. And I would emphasize that all members and all ministers for Home Affairs and Law remember these fundamental principles. That's why I said in my speech, paths taken and paths avoided. If we hadn't taken this path in 1976, neither the police nor Singapore would have today's crime control system.